This is our sixth lecture, and it's a review of the history of conventional economics. Now, this is important because what we perceive as economics today and what our leaders use as economics generally has very little to do with how the past economists have viewed the economy and very little with how the natural scientists, i.e., me and my colleagues, view the economy, which is the topic of the lecture next week. So, this is a review of how humans have tended to view the economy in at least those that have left their perspective in writing in the Western world, especially. Now, obviously, farmers understand economics. They understand they have to invest their own efforts and seeds and whatever in the spring to get the crops ready. Hunter-gatherers probably understood their economy extremely well in terms of migration patterns of animals and ways to hunt them and where the different kind of plants grow at different times of the year. And we understand more and more that our cousins, the gorillas and the chimpanzees, mother gorillas really have an understanding of where different fruits uh, will bloom, will be available at different times of the year. So all of these are basically economic considerations, which for most organisms have economics has meant getting enough food to eat and not getting eaten by something else. But now we're going to look at how humans, modern, quote unquote, modern humans, the last 250 years have viewed economics. And I think this might be my most boring lecture, and I apologize for that in advance, but that's the way economics might be. We'll see what you think when we're done. Um, Now, it is very important that you understand that what's taught as economics today is only one of a variety of ways to think about economics, and I don't even think a very good one. It is almost an accident we think about economics as we do, but there is a monopoly on thought in our Ivy League and et cetera universities, our most prestigious universities, that is very different from how economists in the past, who incidentally I often thought were very, very insightful and clever people, thought about economics. Okay, now the first thing is to understand that economies exist, however we wish to think about them. So here's a couple of girls enjoying a cup of coffee and wearing fancy clothes, all of which have been provided to them from shops and from all over the world, wherever they were made. And the coffee is certainly from somewhere in the tropics. Um, and the clothes are probably from petroleum wells somewhere, or possibly from sheep or cotton that's grown somewhere, probably pretty far away from where they were. So economies exist. Now, how should we study them? Uh, Economics as a discipline, even as a term, economics barely existed before around 1900. The economists that existed, the people that we call economists today, didn't even call themselves economists, but moral philosophers. You figured that one out. Um, Now, the first recognizable school of economics was mercantilists. And this focused on the importance of trade. And it was based on the idea that a nation's wealth and power are best served by increasing exports and trade. You had to quote unquote export more than you could import. I remember hearing this in high school, which caused us all to snicker. Um, you had to export more than so you could accumulate money, and that was thought to be desirable. But money doesn't have any value. I remember a friend of mine saying, I just went to the grocery store and I came out full of with a grocery cart full of groceries, and my wallet was lighter, but I felt much richer. So it's only because you can trade money for wealth that it has value. We'll talk about that quite a bit. And so the idea of the mercantilists, they are representing the mother country, and they want to accumulate wealth and power. And the idea of how mercantilism works is that they restrict the trade between colony A and colony B, and they export the finished products. This is England or Spain or whatever, but specifically England or France, I suppose. And they export finished products at high prices and import raw materials at low prices. And the idea is they get wealth accordingly. And so this is how it happened, is that Europe, in various manifestations, exported manufactured goods and imported uh, sugar and tobacco, timber, fish, um, furs and fish, all of this. You see all those top hats in the old movies, in the movies of old times, and they were made from beavers. So there was a tremendous, that was the original exploitation of North America was for, well, fish initially and then for furs. And unfortunately, slaves got into this whole thing. So Africa exported, or I can't say Africa exported, the colonizers exported slaves chiefly to the Americas. And I think more slaves went to South America actually than North America. And we talked about the original spice trades coming from India and so forth, and how these different directions were influenced by the prevailing winds, which are again based on the energetics of the global heat engine, which we have covered. So these are things that are taking place. And here's a painting of the colonizers. I mean, they were meeting right here. It's depicted as they're meeting as equals, but after a while, through force of arms, England would take over India and its resources. Um, so there's a lot had to do with empires and colonialism. Here's a rather idyllic representation. I don't know what's happening. It looks like maybe a drunk guy in the foreground, but a rather idyllic representation of the trading ships in 1639. And this was, some people wrote about this explicitly and called it mercantilism. And so this is the first, in any way, formalized through writing concept of economics, was called mercantilism. Um, and so then the first school, more, I don't know why the mercantilists were not called a school, but the first formalized school of what the Western world views as economists happened in France about 1750. And this is, they were called the physiocrats, of which Quesnay was the most famous and important, and the and also a guy named Turgot, excuse me, and um, well, here they are, and they believe that all wealth came from land. Now, that makes sense to me at the time, although wealth also came from wind, which is not exactly land, but they believe that the wealth came from the forests, the agriculture, especially, and the mines, uh, so that it did not come from human activity, but it came initially from nature. And nature certainly does the original formation. And Kene, um, this guy apparently was the physician to one of the Louis, to the King of France. And I don't know if any of you have been watching the um, the PBS thing on Sunday night about having a senior moment. The Queen of France there, um, who lost her head to the guillotine. That hasn't quite happened yet, but you'll see how this play. It was on PBS last night. A great show, and this guy is actually in the background of that show, but I don't think he's named. And anyway, as physician to the king, Kene saw similarities between the flow of goods and services and the flow of blood in the human body. Uh, and he saw wealth going from a class of proprietors. Well, it started from the agricultural class who generated the wealth, which would then travel up to the class of artisans and the class of proprietors. And I suppose he's got money going in the opposite direction. I think that's what this is showing. And it's all originating from the soil. Now, one of these guys was appointed, I guess he might be in uh, the movie that I was watching last night, King Louis the 16th, yeah. And this is certainly depicted in the movie Marie Antoinette, that's what it's about. And the King Louis is just paralyzed by debt. And they had borrowed and borrowed and borrowed for all kinds of extravagant expenditures, and nobody wanted to pay off the debt of the king. The king kept borrowing more money to paper over the debt, and there's so many parallels with what's happening today. It's very interesting, and in fact, throughout all of these times, the parallels with what are happening today, it's really quite amazing. So, and so Turgot realized that the anger he could expect those the nobles who had come to expect privileges, financial favors, and privileges, and not pay their taxes. And Turgot said uh, that the king had to stop spending, or the nobles would no longer support them. So here are the French nobles who didn't like being taxed, like to Duke of Orleans and so forth, um, all of which are trying to maintain the wealth that they are accustomed to. And just look at all the wealth in that room. And so the king, of course, kept borrowing, and the French Revolution occurred and so forth. That's not quite happened on the TV show last night. That's next week. So um, and this is important here. Kenney and Turgot believe that all restrictions on free trade should be abolished. It shall be free to all persons, whatever, to carry on as it may seem best to them their trade in corn and flour, to sell and buy it in whatever places they chose throughout the kingdom. Now, this idea of free trade or not comes up again and again as in the various ways or various perspectives people have on economics. Whatever their perspective, this is an independent issue. And they felt there was no need for the government to regulate the prices at which goods were being bought and sold. Kennedy said, do not attempt to fix the prices. Leave that to competition. So here are people who believe in the virtue of competition. And the mercantilists, those that were still left, also pretty much they did not like the idea of any restrictions on trade, and that came up the idea of laissez-faire, leave alone. It's French, and let goods go in wherever men, of course, they say back then, to their own decisions. So that's the formal beginning of the concept of laissez-faire, and it's one that is being hotly debated today. Trump, of course, is very much anti-laissez-faire. Now, these people were called, remember, the physiocrats. And then the next school, quote unquote, of economics is classical economics. And it usually starts with this guy, Thomas Malthus, who was apparently Reverend Malthus. And he is known for his theory of population. Yeah, probably most of you have heard of him. He says the growth of humans, population growth, because it's exponential. If you have more than 2 children apiece, so 3 will equal 9 will equal wherever that goes, 81, so that the population growth has at least the potential to outrun the food supply. And he thought that the betterment of humankind is impossible without stern limits on reproduction. And that meant sex, since there wasn't very much birth control at the time. And that thinking is commonly referred to as Malthusianism. And here's his simple graph that the humans have, or any animal or plant has the ability, because they produce far more offspring than their original numbers, has the potential of growing exponentially, whereas the amount of food that they can produce would increase only linearly. Now, he didn't say exactly why that was, but one can see that it's pretty hard to increase food exponentially. Now, that has not exactly been true because what we have done is increase both the population and the food exponentially through the use of something called the Haber process, but we're not there yet. So that has to do with energy, and we're not talking a whole lot about energy, or are we, today? Okay. Now, the guy who gets the honor of being the inventor of economics, although he didn't call it economics, remember, call it moral philosophy, is this guy named Adam Smith.
Oh, yeah.
And Adam Smith gets his head on the 20-pound note in England. It gets a statue at, I guess that's Cambridge. And he wrote this famous book called The Wealth of Nations. And I have used that title in my book, Energy and the Wealth of Nations, just to let you know that I've stolen a little bit from this guy as well. And he was a very, very thorough and thoughtful person. And Adam Smith is principally remembered for this one sentence. And conservative economists and politicians love to quote this sentence from Adam Smith. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. So the idea in is so fundamental to what we normally call conservative perspective that we have a completely focused perspective on laissez-faire again and self-interest as leading to the good of all. And you see that every day in the economic debates in the newspapers. But if you look at Smith, in terms of his lifetime work, he was not exactly a conservative in today's sense. He said, it is not very unreasonable that the rich should contribute to the public expense, not only in proportion to their revenue, but something more than in that proportion. Now, that is not occurring in our world now. It occurred when I was a child, when I remember reading a newspaper headline when I'm delivering newspapers in the fourth grade during Eisenhower's presidency, that the rich were paying up to 90 odd percent of their income above a certain amount to taxes. And I remember thinking to myself, well, that sounds fair. They've got more money, they should pay more. And then Adam Smith believed in that. And right now, the rich pay only roughly half of what the middle class does in proportion, as a proportion of their income. And how this gets slipped by the population is quite interesting. We will talk about that a little bit. Now, Smith also said virtue is more to be feared than vice because its excesses are not subject to the regulation of conscience. Well, a very interesting fellow, and we're going to talk a little more about him. He wrote also this book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And this is a very different Adam Smith from The Wealth of Nations. Although the author is often misrepresented as a calculating rationalist who advises the pursuit of self-interest in the marketplace, regardless of the human cost, he was also interested in the human capacity for benevolence. And his whole book is all about that. And much of it has to do with securing the basic necessities for everyone through government. Quite the opposite of what people who like to quote him on that one sentence think. He did not particularly trust businessmen. The interest of businessmen is always, in some respects, different from, and even opposite to, that of the public. The proposal of any new law or regulation of commerce which comes from this order ought never to be adopted till after having been long and carefully examined with the most suspicious attention. It comes from an order of men who have generally an interest to deceive and even oppress the public. Does not sound like the people who are quoting him today. Now, as an aside, about that time we had Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo. Now, of interest to this, we normally think that's a good thing. The defeat of Napoleon, and Napoleon certainly caused his share of mischief, especially if you're Russian or German and so forth. But he was extremely progressive with respect to a wide distribution of income. And he wanted to reduce the gulf between rich and poor. But with the defeat of Napoleon, the perspective of the wealth maintaining a greater share of the wealth continued to be dominant because England won at Waterloo. Well, there you have it. That's just an interesting aside. Now, the next great economist, again, he didn't use the word, was David Ricardo. And I'm very impressed by David Ricardo. I think he was well, both he and Smith were great thinkers. I wish I could sit down and have a conversation with him. Here he is. And he was a parliamentarian, a Spanish Jew in England who did very, very well economically and politically. And he wrote Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. And he's known for three, or I guess four things in particular. The principle of comparative advantage. And he would say, if you can produce both wool and wine in Portugal and England, that nevertheless Portugal should focus on the wine because wine or grapes grew better in Portugal and wool grew better in colder England. And so they had a geographical comparative advantage. Now, we have a lot of discussion today of whether we should use comparative advantage or not, and that has a lot to do with free trade or not. But the idea of comparative advantage has become related to whether the labor is cheaper. So when the labor in the US became very expensive, much of our production moved to China, and even in China, labor is becoming too expensive. So a lot of production was moving to Vietnam where it was cheaper and so forth. So that's not what Ricardo was talking about. He was talking mostly about geographical advantages. Temperature grows better wool, thicker wool where it's cold. Although I'd like to add that the finest wool, merino wool, comes out of Portugal. I don't know whether he thought about that. Uh, he talked about something that's very interesting to me, the principle of diminishing marginal utility. That people, that farmers in particular, would exploit the best soil first. And they generally would start at low down in the river valley and work their way upriver and uphill and up the sides of the hillsides or mountains to increasingly poor soil, since the river, the flooding of the floodplains made the best soil. So that he talked a lot and very cleverly about how farmers would the average production of agricultural land would decrease and prices would be set by the least quality land, and others would make a very big profit because they had better land. He was very pro free trade, and especially he wanted to repeal the corn laws, which kept French grain out of England. Now, France is a better place to grow grain than, or corn, they called it, not our corn, but corn meaning grain, than England. But the wealthy landowners of England wanted to keep, wanted England not to import corn to maintain the high price that they got for their relatively rare grain. So there's a conflict between Ricardo and wealthy landowners. And he believed in the labor theory of value, that value was generated by humans applying their labor to whatever it was that was being done. And here's his book. Oh, I've done that. Okay, now those are the two major classical economists, Adam Smith and David Ricardo. But there are others. John Stuart Mill was very influential liberal thinker, said a lot of things that the basis for a lot of American thought. And he was an exponent of utilitarianism and passionate advocate of the value of liberty, spontaneity and diversity, and contempt for compulsive uniformity and the despotism of popular opinion. My goodness. Meanwhile, England had a huge and extremely impoverished, well, I don't know if we can even call them a worker class. They were just a poverty class of people that Charles Dickens uh, was much more important in improving the lot of than as a novelist than was any economist. Meanwhile, arguably, the most important classical economists was Karl Marx. They're all called classical economists because they believed in the labor theory of value. And Marx was almost completely misunderstood and maligned, certainly today. He was a German who lived in London's, poor but financially backed by Frederick Engels, whose father was an industrialist. And he is a much better source for understanding capitalism than of communism. He wrote very little on communism. He advocated it because he didn't like capitalism, but he is maybe his most important perspective, and that runs through what I've said before, is he saw two main classes of people that were inevitably in conflict. The bourgeoisie who owned property and the proletarians or workers. And he saw almost all economics as a conflict between these two classes, that there was a great deal of wealth being produced with early industrialism, with the mills of Manchester, with the railroads, and so forth. But the workers were getting very little of that. Um, and according to Marx's theory of materialism, he said it was scientific, which is absolutely not true. He thought there was primitive communism in early hunter-gatherer societies and a slave society, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, and finally a global stateless communism. He thought that that transition was inevitable, and of course, this was not. Um, but he thought that class struggle is fundamental to human history, and I think he's 100% right there. Although which class is which is a little bit fluid. Marx thought his ideas were most appropriate for industrial society, for England and Germany, and he was surprised when it was taken up by quote unquote backwards Russia and China. Uh, he thought that once the sixth stage was reached, the state would wither away. Of course, the opposite seems to have happened. And strong despots who use communism to generate power. It's just another example of despots using populism to get onto power. Um, all of these thinkers from Smith to Marx are called classical economists today. They all believed in the labor theory of value, and they understood the importance of land and resources. And maybe Marx understood energy, but the focus was on labor. Uh, well, here's something in modern, Marx understood that agriculture robbed the soil. And he was one of the first to understand the necessity, the inevitability of agriculture by itself robbing the soil. And I think that's very important. So, in that sense, he was a biophysical economist, and he didn't publish on energy, but some of his letters said we need to pay more attention to it. Now, the critiques of Marx, spelled wrong, are numerous. Uh, Neoclassical economist Milton Friedman said, inevitably, under socialism, it would lead to authoritarian political regimes. Frederick Hayek was an important conservative economist, um, said the opposite. You know, these people can say anything they want. Marx said communism would lead to freedom, and Hayek said capitalism leads to freedom. And others say that Marxists are going to trample on individual rights because Marxist theory does not care about individual rights and because it's based on class. Now, it's interesting to see what happened uh, to this. That argument, the argument against Marxism continues today. And see a simple idea of Adam Smith totally upset the apple cart of economic thinking. And Adam Smith set this up as a problem, and it's called the, the diamonds versus water paradox. Nothing is more useful than water, but it will purchase scarce anything. A diamond, on the contrary, has scarcity value and use, but a great deal of other goods may frequently be had in exchange for it. And he could not resolve this problem, nor could any of the classical economists. And it led eventually to their downfall as the dominant way of thinking about economics. And that was the resolution of the diamonds versus water paradox is frequently dated from three people. Jevons, remember him from the coal question, um, and Carl Menges and Leon Walras all wrote it about 1871. They all solved the diamonds versus water paradox. And here it is, and they called it the marginal revolution because value was defined not in absolute terms for a unit of water or a unit of diamonds, but at the margin. And what is the margin? The margin meant where you were over their possibility of exploiting it, which is Q. Q is a lot. Uh, and one here is 1 versus 8,000 or arbitrary units. But let's just take liters of water. Your first liter of water, if you were living in a desert, you would pay anything you had for that first liter of water because if you didn't drink it, you'd die. And you'd pay almost as much for the second liter and third and fourth and fifth. By the time you got to the 10th liter of water, well, you could do your cooking, and the 100th liter, you could do your washing. Um, but it was not as valuable as that first liter of water. And then if you had 8,000 liters of water, you're indifferent to it. It has no price. You don't care. So this is the theory of marginal utility, which which decreases as you have more and more. Now, that idea has dominated economics from 1870 odd till today. Why? I don't know. It's an interesting idea. It's a useful idea, perhaps, but it isn't a dominant idea about what economics is about. So they come up with, if you take it economics, you know all of these curves that as the quantity increases, quantity demanded increase, that's the red, and the supply increases or not, you get different prices. And the price is where the demand and the supply intersect, and all modern economics is based on that for some odd reason.
Hmm.
Mostly because it leads to a lot of quite interesting mathematics. Although the mathematics are not necessarily more interesting than something else that might be developed, but that's the way it went. And many people, based on this guy Hayek, an Austrian guy, uh, took up this laissez-faire and the idea of consumer sovereignty. And some wealthy people financed the Mount Perelin Society, which financed Hayek and others, to generate what was called in 1920 or so the Austrian school. And this approach dominates much of economics today, much of conservative economics today, which is let the consumer decide what he or she wants, and then the market will supply it at whatever price it can. All of this is supposed to lead to something called Pareto optimality, another optimizing cloud in the sky of somehow economic systems are leading to a perfect allocation of resources to making us all as happy as possibly can be. Um, well, if you believe in that, I'd like to introduce you to my friend Santa Claus. Um,
Yes.
Economics became
That,
formalized.
yeah.
They call it the study of the allocation of
That's
scarce
funny.
resources amongst alternate users. Now, scarce means to a neoclassical economist not scarce in the sense of scarce energy or scarce good soil or whatever, but scarce meaning money in your wallet. That's it. That's your scarce resources. How do you use it? And they came up, every economics textbook has in the first chapter, this is what an economy is. And we're going to come back to this. It was perceived as firms supplying goods and services to households. Households provided land, labor, and capital to firms, and the money went around the other way, a perpetual motion machine that was our economy. And that's it. And very complex mathematics have been derived from this. Alfred Marshall put this all, formalized all this, and came up with price elasticity and consumer surplus and all of this stuff that somehow um, made economics appear to be a science based in part on Darwin. Um, and he didn't understand Darwin as we do today, or as Darwin did for that matter. But anyway, so it supposedly made it more scientific. And there we were. But there was a big problem. And the big problem was business cycles. This laissez faire led completely to huge cycles, business cycles of overproduction and a crash in prices and crash in production and crash in people's welfare. And it just seemed to occur again and again and again. And this was a big problem with the neoclassical view. Now, then along came this guy, who I think has probably led to more human well-being than anybody else. And who else says that? I don't know. Keynes, John Maynard Keynes. Um, Now, again, I say he's led to more human welfare, and yet he, like the savior of Britain in World War II, was put in jail for being a homosexual. And that's how we repay the people we owe the most to. But anyway, Keynesian economics is a macroeconomic, meaning referring to the large structure of the economy. And he said something very simple, that the government should take a big role in the economy and should pay more, should spend more when the economy is overheating. In other words, when the economy is increasing, the government should pay more. And when the economy is starting to shrink, um, uh, I'm sorry, the government should spend less when the economy, I got that backwards. The government should spend less when the economy, the private economy is expanding, and pay more when the economy was decreasing. And in fact, if you look at the cycles from 1950, as increasingly Keynesian economics was applied by Kennedy and by Johnson and by others, the fluctuations in the United States economy went from an average of, well, you see a great variance going sometimes increasing or decreasing by 10 or more percent a year to increasing or decreasing less than 5% a year. And it became stabilized. Keynesian economics worked. Um, a lot of people don't understand that. Government intervention into the economy empirically smooths out the highs and lows. And I first discovered this when I made this graph in 1970, or published it in 1984. And this is the fluctuations of GNP and also fuel energy use year to year in the United States economy, which has greatly decreased with the increased use of Keynesian economics. And so what that meant was people weren't thrown out of jobs, the whole economy. And that's why I say Keynes has probably generated more public welfare than any other single person in our history. So for whatever reasons, neoclassical economics has completely dominated economic thought, except, I should add, for the injection of Keynesian. And whether Keynesian is in opposition to neoclassical or not, I think it's orthogonal or right angle to. We can discuss that. Most economic investment decisions are made using discounted cash flow with the objective of maximizing profit. And here we are today. So whatever arguments are left, is should we, or how Keynesian should we be? Now, this is despite some clear problems. Today, these problems remain: unequal distribution of wealth. The rich get more and more and more, starting especially with Reagan, and certainly Trump has continued that, and as have some Democrats, but not quite so strongly. The failure of the Phillips curve, which I think we're seeing today, secular stagnation, inflation, externalities such as environmental, let's not mention climate change, and these all have a biophysical basis. Notice since the physiocrats, we've hardly mentioned the environment.
You need to get shots.
And so,
Yeah.
The bottom 50% of income earners, this is the US, have earned less and less of the total. The bottom 50% used to get 20% of the wealth. Now they get about 12% of the wealth. The top 1% used to get 12% of all the wealth. Now they get 20 odd percent. 1% get 20% of our wealth, and that has continued to increase. Phillips curve is supposed to be this. There's a negative relation to between inflation, supposedly, and unemployment rate. So when unemployment is low, inflation is high. That means labor is scarce, they can demand high wages. This is the theory behind the Phillips curve, and it seemed to work pretty well back in the 60s. You see, there's the Phillips curve.
You were interested in this guy. You can be listening.
And then
showing the curve. So.
And then we have what happened during the oil price increases. The reality of the 1970s just blew the Phillips curve out of the water. So that's another problem with neoclassical economics. Another problem is secular stagnation. So the GDP of both the US and the world has been declining, the rate of increase, from a 7% annual rate on average, with a lot of fluctuations, of course, down to an average of, well, we're happy to have 2.5% now. And this is especially, and this is also true for energy uses. The increase has gone to close to zero. And GDP growth of OECD, those are the industrial countries in the world, has in general declined over time. Debt has enormously increased, government debt, and this is government plus private debt has increased. All of these were not talked about very much by neoclassical economists. Production functions are another big failure. They said production is a function just of labor and capital, but they could not resolve Solo's residual, meaning that the increase in labor and capital explained only half of the increase in wealth. We'll come back to that. And then the human population is doing this that economists don't talk about too much. And there's all kinds of weather anomalies that appear to be increasing. Why is this so? Well, they haven't talked about the most basic issues of economics. The main driver is industrialization. This is what is running our economy. This is a German industrial plant. We certainly have the equivalent various places in New Jersey, New York, Louisiana, and Texas, not too much in Oregon. These enormous concentrations of fossil energy use, doing all kinds of things, doing everything that our economy is about. So some 40 years ago, in the journal Science, Nobel Prize winner in economics, Vasily Leontief, another of my heroes more or less, surveyed the then present state of economic models, and he found them to be unable to advance in any perceptible way a systematic understanding of the operation of a real economic system. Instead, they are based on sets of more or less plausible but entirely arbitrary assumptions, i.e., the marginal utility, leading to precisely stated but irrelevant theoretical conclusions. I love that. And that's the economics that dominates the teaching of economics today and the running of our governments. He extolled other investigators, this is Leontief, in demography, sociology, political science, ecology, hey, here I am, biology, health sciences, and energy to help remove the economics from the splendid isolation in which it is found. And that is our next lecture. For a long time, economics seemed to work, especially if you're in the upper 10 or 20% of the income. But where are we now? We're stuck in a hodgepodge of these economic concepts, accentuated by political oddities and enthusiasms, and I might add here, and the interest of the powerful, wealthy class. Biden was essentially a neo-Keynesian. He did with his plan for renewable energy. It's all government spending for big projects, Keynesian, which Trump seems to be dismantling. The Federal Reserve is attempting to tamp down some of the resultant inflation, and we're pretty successful. But we're left with a legacy of Reagan Bush past tax cuts. And so I go back to what Keynes said, practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Well, yeah, Keynesian or a Marxist or whatever. That's what Keynes himself said. And here we are today. Trump seems to be an anti-free trader. It's not clear where he fits into this hierarchy of economists. If you haven't seen Chris Murphy arguing that what's going on today is all just the wealthy negotiating for their own advantage, you should take a look at that or write me and I'll link you to it if I can find it. So we shall see what happens. We shall. Okay, now I'm going to quit screen sharing. I'm going to take a 1-minute break here, which is required by me, and then we will have our discussion. And I think we're still be back in 1 minute.
You want to put the clothes in the dryer?
Hmm?
Would you put the clothes in the dryer?
Yeah.
Whoever is iPad 3, we're hearing about your clothes in the dryer, which is kind of makes me giggle.
Sorry.
I don't see any hands up.
So, Charles, maybe you could just relate it. I don't really have a specific question, but just relate a little bit more when you talked about the current, I don't know if the economic theories is correct, but the universities and the type of economics that they focus on. Could you relate it to what you've now just taught us and how do they fit in there?
I would like to say that that's the next lecture,
Oh, okay.
but what is not, except for this, what is not talked about in our contemporary economics, and I know a lot about this because I talk to a lot of I do have economist friends, and they say yes, neoclassical is completely dominated. Um, so um, what they I asked a friend of mine what he had learned as an economics major at Colgate, my alma mater, and he said that which was the curve I showed you of decreasing marginal utility and increasing marginal cost. So marginalism was dominant in, his 4 years of being an economics major, um, which he believed he was being taught a series of fairy tales. And I'll use that. I think economics is a series of fairy tales. Yes, I do not think it describes what economics is really about. And that's what the next lecture will be, what I think economics is truly about. But I have been saying this for more than 40 years. And I've got 100 or 1,000 fans or whatever out there, but I made very little impact in any official economics department that mostly continues to teach. Well, if you're lucky, you get a course as an economics major. If you're lucky, you get a course in economic history, which I've just given you a thumbnail sketch of. And you realize that what we call economics today is only a tiny part, 10%, 20% of all the great economic thinking of the past. And, even going back to Quesnay and the physiocrats in France in 1750, I think they were closer to having it right than neoclassical economists today, in a way. And they talked about many practical applications of that. So I think that what is taught in economics today is mostly this. And I find that horrible.
What do you think are the biggest things that they leave out? I mean, I kind of have an idea, but I just want to hear it from you. I mean, obviously, soaring debt has just never really been addressed enough for all these people to ignore it for so many generations.
Well,
Um,
I mean, look where we are now. That Trump and Musk are trying to solve the imbalance between income and outcome to the government by cutting government, and they don't talk about taxation. And we've had 30 years of decreasing taxes for the rich, and so they don't even pay us a percentage as much as I. Excuse me, I have to get my dog to work. Come on. Look, I'm busy. No, you can't come on my lap. I've got an 80-pound lap dog. Well, what do people hear? What do you think in any dimension about what Trump is doing now?
how can we answer that without becoming political?
You can be factual.
Well, I do think, you can find other voices. I think they're doing some stuff at University of California, Berkeley, in the economic department there. There's been Joseph Stiglitz, The Price of Inequality. There's a book that I was listening to The Daily Show, and they were having a book review, one-on-one conversation, I should say, with a guy named Chris Hughes. And he's written a book called Market Crafters. the 100-year struggle to shape the American economy. And it's a revelatory, it says, unexpected history of the rise of American capitalism and an argument that entrepreneurial leaders in government, not the mythical free market, created the most dynamic economy. So
Absolutely.
it sounded really interesting. I read it, wrote down the name. I haven't read it, but I think there are voices. Like if you read like the Nation magazine over the years and stuff like that, these things are out there but they don't get play because I don't think it's to the interest of the elites. I think we've been captured with our identity and everything in a kind of world where we revile people in government now and revere people in business. I
I just
mean,
want to make
I
another
okay.
push for our book, Energy and the Wealth of Nations. And I want to, Carol, that's very insightful and good points that you make, except the difference. I mean, I can't get into the full difference without destroying the reason for the next lecture, where I will cover what I want to cover in great detail. I mean, given it's an hour. But yes, there are people who are criticizing, Piketty comes to mind, and
Yeah,
also the people you talked about,
yeah,
who have criticized the bad aspects of conventional economics, but they do so from the perspective of the social sciences alone. And my critique that's in here, written with an economic historian, Kent Klitgard, is see now energy and the wealth of nations. That's Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. And what we're saying is that, and what next lecture will be about, is that you can determine the wealth of nations almost one for one with the use of energy. And all the rest of the stuff is, the second significant figure, maybe the third. And energy is the first significant figure. And so in statistical analyses. And so what the critics that you talk about are saying is that there are all these social inequities. And certainly economists, as social scientists, many of them, Stiglitz is great, in my opinion. I like him very much. Are all focused on the social problems of conventional economics, not the biophysical ones. And Stiglitz said in 2008, after the big plunge in everything in markets at that time, he said that he used the analogy of the ode to the Grecian urn, of that wonderful poem by Keats, I think it. And beauty is truth, truth is beauty, beauty, truth. That's all there is to know and all you need know. And he said the economists got caught up in the beauty of their mathematical statements. And as a consequence, lost all touch with reality. And these mathematical statements are based on, these almost illusionary curves, and Pareto optimality and all these almost hypothetical concepts. And that's what they focus on. And how that is connected with reality is tune in next week, please. We will.
well, I sometimes think maybe they don't take into account other variables in their equations. I mean, if you're only going to look at certain things and how they relate to each other, and you don't take into maybe quality of life or energy, or I mean, sometimes they don't want to make their equations. Maybe it needs to have more ornaments in these equations to make the equations of any more value, because they're not valuable when you eliminate some variables. I'm
Well,
thinking, I
the
don't know.
question will be, will you still think that after next lecture?
Yeah, I don't know. But I do think the imagination or the identity of people in our society has to change for things to happen, because people really want to identify themselves as business people. Or, I mean, my husband and I had to be in business. That's how we eventually were able to retire. But, we went and got a classical education and didn't have majors that we would market. So we went into business. And so we were kind of like, people would say, you think that and you're a businessman? Well, yeah, we do. But I'm just saying people's identity is caught up a lot of times with things. And unless you kind of change people's minds, I mean, because people now go to school and they just need to find a job, you know what I mean? They want to think about too many things. And so you're captured to the culture that's imprinted on you by the really very wealthy people. And I feel like the top 10% are captured mentally by the 0.01% of people that are telling us what is of value,
Well, you
what
can
you should
count them.
aspire to or go to. Like I said a couple of weeks ago, you need to have a bigger home. You have to have a bigger kitchen. You're kind of in a hamster wheel. You have to send your kids to a certain school, blah, blah, blah. You're just you have to look at your portfolio. You have to, it gets exhausting to be caught into this
Well,
wheel.
you can thank the Mount Perelman Society, and I mean that, in Hayek,
Yeah,
because
I
that
agree. Because, I like to read some of these articles that challenge you in another place like The Nation magazine or something, to think, oh, there's another way to perceive how you're living your life.
well, two things in my particular case. I was in graduate school when all this hippie revolution took place, and people for a while eschewed those values and claimed to be into peace and love and nature and whatever. And I found that very appealing. But also, I joined the culture of science, and I recognize very much. I've had millions of dollars of research money over federal research money over my professional career, not for doing this stuff, incidentally, for doing other kinds of science. And I never could get money to do the important stuff. And uh, but I entered a culture of science that I understood perfectly well was supported by thousands of businessmen and women. Um, and that they, dug out the oil and grew the food and generated. I worked most of my life for the state of New York. New York is a wealthy. I have excellent medical benefits still, and so forth and so on, uh, because I lived in an industrial state that generated enormous amounts of wealth from burning oil. And it gave me the freedom to be a scientist with whatever anti or non or whatever business or growth or whatever perspective I wanted to. But I understood right from the beginning that I was being paid from the profits of an oil intensive state. And I also worked for two nuclear labs. So been there, done that. And how we can change the world. Well, again, I'm going to talk about that next time. And then we're going to have a complete discussion on the 8th meeting in which you can say any bloody thing you want. And I'm not going to have I'm going to have a 10-minute review, or maybe it's a 20-minute review. And then it's just going to be open, and you bloody well better be asking me questions. Or we'll just sit there and like bumps on a log and look at each other. Okay, but I'd like a few more questions today.
Can I get could I get Carol to just repeat the name of that book? You talked about
Oh.
Stieglitz, and then you talked about another book. I didn't catch
Well,
the.
this one, I just heard about it a week ago. It just sounded good because I heard them talking about it. Market Crafters,
Market Craft.
the 100-year struggle to shape the American economy. But if you just look up the author's name, Chris Hughes, and then Market Crafters, you can get the whole big name.
Thank
It
you.
just sounded like it was very interesting.
Mhm.
Well,
No,
you
And I
can
understand he
really
was a
see-
co-founder of Facebook too. So that's an interesting sidebar of this
Okay.
person.
You
But
can
anyway.
really see what he's talking about in the free marketeers, the leave us alone, farmers, etc., of Eastern Oregon or of the middle of the United States, and there's no part of this country that has benefited more from federal expenditures than the West. The dam projects, the free grazing on public land of cows, and all of
farmers.
these people who are anti-government, you can almost always the guy who really ticked me off the most was he was the most anti-government guy you ever saw. And he made all of his money building airports for small communities in Alaska. Yeah, he did heavy construction, of hacking out these airports from wilderness. Total every bit of his millions of dollars was made on government money for developing airports and the like.
There's a lot of stories like that.
Oh
A lot
yeah,
of people.
How about
Yeah.
Elon? I mean,
Yeah,
not to
you know,
mention,
wow,
not to mention.
I know. And it's like, it's so apparent. But there's so many people with the identity that these business people are wealthy, they're wealthy because they did it themselves and they're so intelligent and and like I say, the myths are just
Well,
killing us.
here's the problem. Once you're a senator, you're elected a senator. On day one, you have to bring in, I think it's $5,000 for your next campaign.
He's dialing for dollars, they would call it.
And you
Yeah,
have to do that for 6 years or you won't be reelected.
right.
And that's an issue. And then the Supreme Court passes this so-called Citizens United, which is the
Yeah.
most,
Money is speech, they said. Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
So there we are. I mean, we have these very, very simple, fundamental issues that are easily resolved, except we can't do it. And one is get rid of Citizens United. Another is bring the tax rates of the wealthy back to where they were in 1950, even 1960s. And that'll take care of most of the big problems we have with something like having something like a democracy. Now, there's all this misinformation, but the misinformation is always with us. And you look at the first election between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, there was as much invective back and forth and as much misinformation as anything that happens today. So there's nothing new about that. And I don't know how you deal with it.
Well, the media has certainly come, does its share of facilitating the fairy tale and the denials and
Absolutely.
raising the rich up to be these superheroes, mega important people, and they don't call them on the untruths and they make them seem larger than life and like they're doing more than they really are, other than looking out their own self-interest.
Well, so the wealthy, if you give $5 million or $5,000 to a congressman, you're going to expect something in return, I would suspect. And that's pretty much how it works. And maybe how it's always worked, And
Charles.
how do you deal with that? Well, the first thing you do is get rid of Citizens United.
Charles, how do we access the recording of this and the other lectures?
I'm going to send it to you. I hope right now, please send to me whatever, well, not right now because I got to let my computer. Eric, I'm going to have to try to get this recording to you because I don't think you did the beginning of it. I'm not sure. But anyway, I will send within about an hour, I will send the link that somebody just sent me. I saw it, but haven't opened it. That should work because I guess the previous link has not been working. I don't understand that. But what I have to do right now, we're at the end of our hour and a half. What I'm going to do right now is I've got to let my recording take over my computer and it stores it and so forth. And then I'm able to send an email and I'm going to go have lunch in the meantime. But is there a remaining question from anybody? Okay. Was it boring? No? Couple
I
of
enjoyed it.
Mhm,
I,
I
I,
liked
I
it.
I have a couple of lectures on this because it went by quickly and, more I need to learn. So I found it very interesting.
It
next
was
lecture, I hope is even more interesting.
it was a totally great flash, a flash lesson in the history of economics in 30 minutes.
And
So,
economics is not what they teach today. Economics is a whole suite of things with great minds over 250 years. And so we only get the last 50 years or something. And it's kind of crazy. Okay, goodbye, everybody. See you next week.